welcome. Today, let's talk about my anxiety today, currently, and what it was like for me dealing and contending with health anxiety, agoraphobia, just generalized anxiety disorder. Now, I don't suffer currently from anxiety. Anxiety does pop up periodically, as it should, naturally, when life throws its novelty my way. Makes sense. But how I react to the novelty is a lot different than how I used to react to the novelty. How I used to react to the novelty is, well, being overwhelmed by it because my emotional glass was full. It was overflowing. And then whenever novelty would pop up, I would explode. I remember one time I got a ticket and I broke down in front of my ex-girlfriend about getting a ticket and being all emotional about it. And looking back, I'm embarrassed, but I actually get what happened because it wasn't just the ticket, right? It was everything else happening in my life. I was not happy in my relationship. I was contending with all of my addictions and instant gratifications and not being fully fulfilled in my job and all of these things. But I wasn't appropriately dealing with all of the novelty in my life. So really, in my recovery, I've learned how to deal with the novelty, how to resolve, how to properly build trust within my body, because I had no trust that my body could withstand real hardships. My body was viewed by me as this fragile thing that could break and shatter. But also I had to build trust that I could say no to things I felt like I couldn't say no to. I was a puppet to my desires. I was reflexive in my habits of, well, marijuana or sex, pornography. These things had a hold over me and I felt like I had no control over it. So much of my recovery and much of my life today is about sacrifice. Sacrificing things that are desirable today will benefit me tomorrow. And I've learned that going through recovery, that I have more control over my circumstances and how I feel than I thought I did. What were the three main things that were contributing to my anxiety? First, I didn't have a plan of action. I was running around with my head cut off. I didn't have structure. I didn't have a routine. I didn't have discipline. Number two, old habits caught up to me. Habits that seemed to be fun and nice and satisfying in my 20s caught up to me when I'm 30, right? They caught up. And what I mean by that is diet. The foods are tolerable when you're 20, but when you're 30, I don't think you should be eating pizza, sugar, processed foods. Got to cut that out. The next thing is that there's no optimal challenge. There was no optimal challenge in my life. I needed challenge. The meaning was coming into my life through external means, through alcohol, through pleasures. But in the end, they were only producing more snakes and only keeping me in this lost state of mind on Pleasure Island, not taking on any responsibility and, being free to do anything. Well, being free to do anything is not good because, if you're free to do anything, you just don't know what to do. You're just a paralyzed rabbit, right? It's like free to do anything. You need a structure and you need to operate in a structure and in a frame. So the habits that I later introduced to help my anxiety helped build a structure. It helped me to build more trust in my body because the habits were adding optimal challenge and it was building upon how I viewed myself as a person. I learned to be more courageous Because with anxiety, I had to go out into the unknown and confront my fears in order for me to build on this trust that, hey, you know what? Even though I'm confronting my mortality out in public, even though it's causing me a lot of panic, I'm learning that I could actually withstand it and that I'm capable of much more than I thought I was capable of. And so I believe that you have to know thyself. And that's a quote from Socrates. It's inscribed on the Apollo of Delphi, I believe. But anyways, I love this because you have to confront your insecurities, you have to confront your fears, your guilt, and your shame in order to transcend it, right? You have to shine light on these parts of you, and those are the parts of the shadow, the parts of the psyche that you do not want to contend with, the unintegrated parts of your psyche that you need to shine a light on in order to properly integrate them, like the anger, the aggression, these little deities that operate within you that you have no control over. And so I've learned that to properly address my anger today, I've learned to, talk to myself in a different manner, to sit down and say, okay, well, what happened back there, Brad? What happened? Why were you so angry? Why did this take over? What was going on? And so I have enough emotional space in my glass to deal with the novelties of life rather than being so overreactive, because I've lessened all of that through not only my habits but dealing with my past, contending with what I've been through before, my traumas, my shadow sides, the guilt and the shame and all of my fears even. So because I've been dealing with all of those and contending with that, I have enough emotional space to contend with all the other novelty that comes up regularly. So I sit with myself and I say, well, what happened? Like, I use my internal dialogue, my left hemisphere, to contend with the chaotic right hemisphere, the right hemisphere producing the imagistic representations of what's out in the unknown, right? Because when people damage their left hemisphere, they're overwhelmed by negative emotion. They sink so far into negative emotion, and that makes sense because the left hemisphere, through its rational dialogue, helps you to calm down the chaotic right hemisphere. And so I talk to myself because that hemisphere helps you formulate a plan and helps you navigate through the fogginess of the unknown. So sit down and talk to yourself. Okay, what happened back there? How could I avoid this situation again in the future? Is there anything I did personally to contribute to what happened? And I think that's unbelievably useful because in an argument with Maggie, I'll sit with myself afterwards and say, okay, well, I think I'm right. I'm pretty sure I'm right. But is there 5% at least of something that I contributed to this argument that, I could acknowledge? Maybe there's something I did. And then something comes up and I'm like, I could have avoided that before. And I've realized through recovery that there's this pathway that you follow, and that when you start to go back along the pathway, you start to realize that there are points along the way where you steered off the path, and that's enlightening, if not, really hard to deal with. A lot of people who go to psychotherapy, they have a hard time contending with what they did to themselves to contribute to the suffering, because they realize that 95% of them at least is no good. Their programming is no good, and that they need to reprogram much of who they are. Their habits are no good. Their mindset is no good. The path that they were on was so far off the path that, acknowledging that is is overwhelming. And so I think that going forward in recovery, you have to really look at, the truths of your past. And so going back to the shadow, which Carl Jung coined the term shadow, looking at that dark part of yourself is no joke. And I realized I was a puppet towards much of the things in my life that I had no control over. And it makes sense because I didn't have a control over them. I felt like a puppet. I felt like the porn usage and the weed consumption and all of these other things that I was doing, video games or Netflix or social media, all these things, that they have more of a hold over me than I have of it. And that's no easy thing to acknowledge. But I've learned that optimal challenge is the way forward. That's what brought a lot of meaning into my life. The optimal challenge of overcoming the things that I don't have control over, and realizing that I have more control over it, I started to look at myself from a different perspective. But also, I want to go back to the being more courageous point that I was talking about earlier. With health anxiety, I thought I was a weak, fragile person, but when I started to expose my body to optimal challenge, cold exposure, rigorous exercise, or being in public places that made me panicky, I realized that my body was capable of a lot more. And then by doing meditation, breath work, and then exercise, and then spending time in nature, reading, I realized that, I'm calming my body down by exposing it, right? My body, by exposing it to extreme stress, my body was able to relax more. And that's an interesting thing to think about as well. By exposing it to that extreme stress, I was able to relax afterwards, that I was adding more positive benefits that were extending further across time than saying watching Netflix and having no real positive benefit extending, right? So engaging in meditation, that benefit of doing it in the morning would last all day. But like if I were to say watch Netflix in the morning, that would just last until I was done watching, and then I would have to confront reality. And it's just, I wasn't prepared at that point for reality. Netflix was just a distraction. And I'm not against Netflix. Netflix is great. I watch Netflix sometimes, but it's only appropriate at certain points, right? With a certain time span. Right? Like I wouldn't recommend watching it for hours and hours. But anyways, how does one commit to anxiety recovery when you just couldn't commit to anything in the past? And you wanted to go to a gym, you wanted to go on a diet, but you couldn't stick to it. Well, how do you stick to recovery? Now here's the exercise. Ask yourself these questions. Write these down. Number 1, what would my life be like 5 months down the road to 1 year if I changed? What would that look like? How do I want to be in the world? How do I want to feel? How do I want to act? How do I want to look? What do I want in my relationships? What do I want in my career? What do I want? What would be desirable? And so that's really useful because you're setting an aim, but also what would my life be like a year from now if I don't change at all? And then you want your anxiety moving you forward. You want to attach a lot of fear to staying in the same place, and then you want to add a lot of desire to the North Star of where you could go. So adding structure into your life, adding a coach, adding a plan. That's why I made the anxiety recovery program, is because I wanted to give you guys just some sort of structure, a plan of action, something you can do every day to help move you towards the person that you can become. Because what you subject yourself to regularly determines what you value, right? If you're subjecting yourself to negative friends, toxic relationships, you're exposing yourself to violent movies all the time, and then loud, angry music, and then it's just like you're exposing yourself to these stimuli like drugs, alcohol, pornography. You're just showing yourself that this is what you value, right? And your unconscious understands that, and it'll move you towards what you value. But if you start to sacrifice these things that you value for the hope and the faith that your future self could thrive, then that's where the challenge really comes. Taking on the responsibility that things could be better, and taking on the responsibility that your current state of being needs to change and be reprogrammed. That's eye-opening. And that's where I'm going to leave you on today's video. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your awesome comments below. Please, I highly recommend you check out the Anxiety Project program. It's on my website, and it's the link is down below, but it's on my website at unpluganxiety.com. Rise above anxiety. I'll see you next time. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and that bell so that whenever a new video of mine appears, you will be one of the first to know. Namaste.